Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Hello, would that be Professor David Flint? Hello?
Can you hear me?
I can, loud and clear. We're having a little telephone trouble this morning, sir. How are you?
Very good, thank you. And you?
Wonderful to hear your voice again. Where have you been? You've been very quiet lately, or I haven't... Oh, well, you see, I'm comparing that with the very busy days of the referendum on the Republic.
I keep myself to Spectator. I have a column in Spectator, and I do a bit of work on... I do a couple of interviews on 2GB.
Oh, yes.
And then I have ADH TV, which is where Alan Jones is.
Yes, I'm just learning this wonderful world that is beyond what, I don't know what we'd call it, the old-fashioned technology. This business of running a radio program and radio station from a dining room table seemed like a very strange idea until I actually saw it working. Amazing.
It is, isn't it? It's wonderful. This little group has established studios in Sydney near Chippendale, just small studios,
yes.
And they have a regular programs, and it seems to be working very well.
No, well, I think the more voices that are out there, particularly voices that will balance what I rightly or wrongly consider to be a very left-wing media, the more voices that can balance all that off, the better.
Oh, I think you're so right. It's so much more democratic, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I call it the court of public opinion, which is hopefully still the most powerful court in the land. And mind you, there are people who would not like that very much. Public opinion, I mean. They want to see the world through the prism that they see the world through and invite us to do the same or else.
Yes, it's a very narrow world, isn't it? And one joined by the managerial executives and the big corporations.
Now, you are a constitutional lawyer, and you're the head of the Monarchist League as well. Are you still there at the top of that?
Yes, it's Australians for Constitutional Monarchy. Yes, that was the organisation that ran the referendum no campaign.
Yes. And a very successful campaign it was. All you did, and all you really had to do, is to point out the holes in the other argument.
Yes, I think it was a harder campaign than the current one. I think this is something where the people have very quickly come to a conclusion, and a sensible conclusion, according to all of the opinion polls.
Yeah. The opinion polls, I worry about them. They can't. They might lull people into a false sense of security. There's no safety.
That's a danger.
Yeah. And they have been wrong in the past, but I agree with you. I don't think that there will be anything but a no vote. But I reckon it's got to be a very strong no vote, 70 and no less, because if you don't get rid of this thing once and for all, and for the right reasons, it's not that we're voting no to cheat somebody out of his rightful entitlements. I mean, the whole thing that has been put to me, if you read the 26 pages of the Uluru Message from the Heart, and I'm sure you have, our Prime Minister, of course, hasn't, it's right there in black and white for people to see what the real agenda is.
Oh, without doubt.
Yeah, and the real agenda is this treaty. I mean, yes, a yes vote is kind of code for treaty, I gather.
Yes, and the reparations and the truth-telling, yes.
Yeah. Well, so many people, I walk around and I see that there are yes posters and there are badges on people's lapels. And I think to myself, how could people be conned like this? I mean, have they not looked, or are they just trusting Albanese, or what is it that's really behind? Or people just think it's a nice thing to do, to vote yes.
I think they haven't done their homework. They're voting on the vibe.
Yeah, but if we, as we're being told, back in the Day of Land Rights, WIC, and all of that, the people will try and put out a scare campaign that people will lose their backyards. Well, for God's sake, I mean, if you look at the ownership of this land, 55% at the moment is owned by, or Aboriginals have legal title to, 55%. A lot of people must have lost their backyards, so it wasn't a scare campaign.
Oh, no, not at all.
I don't understand it. What do you, from a constitutional law point of view, what is the real danger if this voice thing does get up?
Well, we don't know what it means. It purports to be recognition, but the question is misleading because it's not about recognition. It's about establishing the voice. And the voice will be an entity, a constitutional entity. It will be a new chapter in the Constitution, the first new chapter in the Constitution since the time of Federation. We've never done such a major change to the Constitution as to put in a new chapter. That will be a very clear signal to the High Court that something very important is meant to be done. The High Court has hitherto shown no reservation whatsoever in recent years in jumping to conclusions favouring the interests of those claiming special rights, rights different from those for other Australians. And the High Court has also accepted a definition of indigeneity which is very loose. It's a tick-a-box definition of indigeneity. The High Court recently, for example, in legal terms, within the last couple of years, handed down a decision in which they decided that the power of the federal government to deport violent criminals on the conclusion of their sentences could be lost. The government would not have that power in the event of people who, although they are not citizens of Australia, could, in the view of the High Court, claim indigeneity. And two persons convicted of very serious, violent crimes were not allowed to be deported by the High Court because they were held to be indigenous, although they were citizens of other countries and not of Australia.
But the High Court judges are not silly or naive. Why would they come to a conclusion like that?
I think, with the greatest respect to the High Court, there is among the, if I may call it, the ruling class, a feeling that we must be doing something to show a degree of moral superiority in relation to the treatment of the indigenous people. Now, I am not a racist. When I was a younger lawyer and law student, I remember I was encouraged to go and help, to volunteer with Hal Wooden. Hal Wooden was a Queen's Counsel, and he became a distinguished judge in New South Wales. He'd been president of the Press Council. Mm-hmm. Hal Wooden was in the process of establishing a voluntary Aboriginal legal service. Mm-hmm. It is now a government entity, a government-funded entity. It was completely voluntary. And we spent our time helping the Aboriginal people in relation to legal matters, which was an important way of assisting them. We couldn't in those days do the things which people can do today. We couldn't go to welcoming ceremonies, for example, because there weren't any. We couldn't wave an Aboriginal flag because at that stage it hadn't been designed and adopted. We couldn't do those things which people can do today, but we could do something which we thought was practical, and so practical that eventually it was taken over by the Commonwealth and funded by the Commonwealth.
Yeah, I don't know what it costs these days, but it would be a pretty penny.
Yes, it's a substantial institution, as many are, because we know that something over 30 billion is allocated to all of these organizations.
But it doesn't get to the people, though, does it?
It doesn't, because the problem of the gap, and this is what is being argued by the yes case people in the coming referendum. They say that if this voice is put into the Constitution, it will solve the gap. It will close the gap.
Oh, rubbish.
It will do nothing of the sort.
No.
This organisation will be the target of what has been called the long march through the institutions, that is, of the far left, taking over various institutions. One which they targeted in particular were the education departments of the nation, so much so when a commentator in New South Wales, Kel Richards, who's a wordsmith, a great wordsmith, but is also a commentator, he was irritated on one occasion during the reign of a Liberal government in New South Wales, a coalition government in New South Wales, and he was trying to get to the minister to complain about serious problems in the schools. And he was contacted eventually by the minister's media advisor who said, listen, Kel, listen, we run the minister's office. The Marxists run the Department of Education. We're not going to have a stand-up fight with them.
Yeah.
Here you have what was happening in New South Wales for the long period of the last Liberal government.
Yes.
They did nothing to cure the situation in education, which has been turned into indoctrination by those people.
Yep, totally agree. They got their bum,
through the institutions.
but they got their bum kicked. They're out of office. But why would they be impotent? Why would they not do something about it? Philosophically, you'd imagine they'd be in the position to do it.
You would think so, but they didn't have the moral strength and courage that a Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan would have done, and cleans out the Department of Education. Because you've got to be tough to do that. You've also got to fight the mainstream media, they'll find one or two cases where your policy is having some alleged disadvantage, and that will be played up, and that's the way it will be killed off. But you really need to be strong and tough. And what has happened in New South Wales is happening, I gather, in all the states, and that is, and we have proof of this in education, we have proof that the standards in Australia are declining rapidly, particularly in literacy and numeracy. Yeah. We are falling behind the students of other countries, and as more money is poured into education, as the federal government puts its nose into education, which under the Constitution has nothing to do with the federal government, we're finding a serious deterioration in education, which is very damaging for the young people of Australia and for the future of the country.
Yeah, they should get back to teaching, but they don't want to teach. They want to lecture. They want to indoctrinate, as you say.
Well, the same thing will happen if this voice is established. It will be the target of the extreme left, of the neo-communists, or whatever they choose to call themselves, Marxists. They will take it over, as they've taken over every education department, as they've taken over so many important instrumentalities in this country, including some of the boards of some of the corporations in this country.
It would seem, yeah.
Yes. We will see this with the voice. There will be demands by the voice to proceed with the rest of the Uluru Statement, which, as you pointed out, the Prime Minister hasn't read. There's a debate as to how long the Uluru Statement is, but certainly it is supported by other documents, which are, whether or not they're part of the Uluru Statement is an interesting debate, but the point is that they're there, and the Prime Minister has committed himself to the rest of it, which includes the treaty, which includes truth-telling, which includes reparations.
Yeah, well, if you look at the voice as a stalking horse or a Trojan horse, which carries who knows what inside the gates, it is a truly frightening prospect. But what you say about the education departments is so true. I mean, if you can control, as any good socialist or Marxist will tell us, if you can control the classrooms and you can control the media, you've got the thing sewn up.
You have indeed, and hitherto, I remember in 1999, there was a former judge, he'd been the former governor of Victoria. He produced his own cranking Republican model, the McGarvey model, but he used to regularly say that Australians are a wise constitutional people. and they've rejected a number of referendums. We must remember that Australians are criticised for rejecting referendums. We must never forget that the founders, I think, it's not a perfect constitution, and I suspect they made a mistake. They should have given the power to introduce referendums, not only to, say, a couple of states as well as the Commonwealth. At the present time, only the politicians in the Commonwealth, in Canberra, in the majority politicians running the government, can really introduce a referendum to change the constitution. What they should have done was what the then Premier of South Australia, Charles Kingston, proposed to Deakin. His was that the people of Australia should be empowered themselves to initiate referendums, as is the case in Switzerland. And that would exercise that accountability over the politicians, which we cannot. We used to be able to do it through the normal course of pre-selections and elections, but in both of the principal parties, much of the pre-selection process has been taken over by power brokers, and they've managed quite often, not always, but quite often, to completely neutralise the rank and file of the major political parties and take over the choice of candidates. And hence we see candidates coming from a class of advisors who rise through the clubs, the Liberal clubs, Labour clubs, and so on. They're politicians in training, and they owe allegiance to a particular power broker, and they're put in. They have no experience of life. They go straight from...
never had a job.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's typical of most of the parliamentarians today. They've never had a real job. They've always worked in the political sphere or the trade union sphere. And so they have a very limited view. You don't get a man like, say, Chifley, for example, who was a train driver, or Menzies, who was the most brilliant King's Counsel in the country, going into politics, giving up what they've got. In Menzies' case, giving up a very good income and turning into a politician.
Professor,
we don't have that anymore.
Go on.
We just have this narrow class of trainee apprentices.
I agree with you. Take it back to the people. Professor David Flint is my special guest. Tell me, Professor, what does it cost to take a case to the High Court?
Oh, it would cost. It would bankrupt most people, even people with a good house in Sydney, worth a few $1 million. Well, we saw that with the case, which hasn't gone to the High Court yet, concerning the soldier.
Yes.
It was an enormous amount of money, and he needed to borrow from his employer.
Yes, I know. That was millions and millions of dollars. So how did Eddie Mabo get to the High Court?
Well, of course, with some people, you are funded by the government to go to the High Court. We have the ridiculous situation, for example, of those who come to Australia as students or as tourists, who at the end of their visas suddenly decide that if they went back home, they would be persecuted, even if their home is Malaysia, which is hardly a country which persecutes their people. And they claim refugee status in the last few months of their stay in Australia. And then the Commonwealth rushes to fund their legal costs, and they fight on, and they stay for years while they fight that case. You, no doubt, and your listeners would be in a situation where they have legal costs, but they pay those legal costs themselves.
Well, that would deter people from taking... I mean, if somebody's going to pay your legal costs, that incentivizes almost anyone to come up with anything. If he knows...
So instead of boat people, we have people flying in who become refugees. We have about 100,000 people claiming refugee status in Australia at the moment, and the government doesn't do much about it except pay for their legal fees. And how often do your listeners have their legal fees paid for?
No, grossly unfair.
I wonder.
Grossly unfair. I like your idea of taking all this referenda stuff back to the people, as you say, as the Swiss model goes. Professor, can I ask you, when I sit there and watch the news at night on television and I see the Prime Minister and other people standing there with three flags, there's the Australian flag, the Aboriginal flag and the Torres Strait Island flag, is that constitutional? Why three flags? We should have one flag.
I agree with you, and certainly if you have a second flag, it should be the state flag. But there's certainly no need to have three. Under the Keating government, they did proclaim the Indigenous flag as a flag of Australia, and no coalition government has dared to withdraw that status. But I agree with you. I think it is inappropriate. For example, in New South Wales, we had the case of the former Liberal Premier, Mr. Perrottet, deciding that the Indigenous flag should be on the Harbour Bridge, and they did an investigation and found that it could cost somewhere between 20 and 30 million to put a couple of flagpoles on the Harbour Bridge.
Good God.
They must have gone to a government contractor for that fee.
Yes.
So he took down the New South Wales flag and said that will be floated in an appropriate place in Macquarie Street. Yeah. And we now have on the flag the second flagpole equal with the other flagpole at each. I think they're at either end. Certainly they're on the bridge, and we have the Indigenous flag.
Yeah, totally wrong. Totally wrong. But
and it was never a flag of the Indigenous, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island tribes didn't have flags. There was no sovereignty here in the sense that we understand it.
No, and there was no welcome to country. That's a very, very modern invention. Yes. I've actually talked to the person who used to use it as part of his stand-up routine. There's an Eddie Mabo fellow. He told me, he said, I never cease to be amused when I hear them doing it because I only did it for a joke. But there you go.
Now when you go to the Opera House in Sydney, before the curtain rises, there's a statement of welcome to country and a reference to recognising not only the past, present leaders, elders, but also the emerging elders that are to be acknowledged, which is foisted on us.
All of this for 3% of the population. I would think that the Chinese would have a greater section of the population, or the Greeks, the Italians, all of whom played a very important role in the development of Australia. And I don't sort of see so many of them standing around with their hands out.
Yes, well, this is why we're having this conference that I mentioned when we were talking the other day. It's on Monday the 9th, having a conference at Parliament House on the future of the Constitution, because this voice is not the only thing of concern in the government's agenda for change of the Constitution. If the voice gets up, we are within apparently in the second term, if the government has a second term, we're going to have a second referendum on a republic, and this will presumably be the model which has been released by the Australian Republican movement, which works hand in glove with the national conferences of the Australian Labor Party, and that will be for a republic in which the checks and balances, the normal checks and balances which apply to the Prime Minister and the politicians, will not apply. The President will be stripped of the reserve powers, which are crucial in a Westminster-style system.
And what does that mean? What do they provide?
Well, for example, the power to require that the Prime Minister observe the constitution of the country, and if, for example, he cannot provide supply, if the government for some reason cannot provide supply, then the Prime Minister must resign and advise an election or advise the Governor-General to call on somebody else to form a government. And that is something which was universally accepted as the correct constitutional position, so much so that when Labor was trying to force this onto the coalition governments up to the 70s, Mr. Whitlam, as leader of the opposition, had Senator Murphy table in the Senate a list of 169 occasions when Labor had taken that position in the Senate and insisted that if it could get a majority in the Senate to block supply, the government must resign.
Yeah.
An election should be called. And that was the position of Mr. Whitlam. And Mr. Whitlam knew this was the constitutional fundamentals. And there are other aspects of the Constitution which a Governor-General would require, and a governor would require that the government follow. And if it can't follow them, it should resign. For example, if for example, the government lost its majority in the House, it would have to resign.
Yeah, so these are checks and balances that we've become used to and depend on.
Yes, and this is essential because it's not like the American system where the Constitution makes the president the executive. In our Constitution, the executive is vested formally in the Crown, but exercisable by the leader, the person who has the confidence of a majority in the lower house and can provide supply to the government. And it's all of these are normally observed, but if they're not observed, you've got to have somebody to control that person, and that's the whole point of having in place a governor or governor-general, and in a republic a president. But this model is going to strip the president of that power. But in addition, it was to provide, to placate those who want to elect the president. It was going to provide for a popular election of the president, but it would be an election which would be more appropriate to a banana republic because the politicians would choose the candidates. You wouldn't have people. When Bill Hayden was at the Constitutional Convention in 1999 and proposed a republic, he proposed an election of a president in which all of the candidates would be nominated. I think it was by 1% of the population. But under this model, only the politicians will be able to nominate the candidates, so there'll be some election.
Yeah, that'll be neat.
Yes, and that's the republic. But the next thing that they have, and may well be earlier, is the misinformation and disinformation bill.
Oh, that'd be aimed at people like you and me.
Yes, and that will significantly change two constitutional aspects if it's passed, and then the High Court doesn't declare it invalid, which it may not, and that is that it'll take away the separation of powers. The crucial part of the separation of powers is that the courts are completely separate and non-political. Well, it'll turn a government agency, ACMA, which controls broadcasting
media,
that will be the body which will make the judicial determination whether somebody is committing misinformation or disinformation.
And who's going to sit in judgment on that?
Well, this body, ACMA, will make the decisions.
But the body, there'd be a board of faceless people, or
just the board of ACMA will make those decisions. Under this bill, it'll be a very powerful court if it goes through. The other thing it will change is we have, not in the Constitution, but the High Court has found correctly that if you have a representative democracy, it'll only work. It assumes that people have a freedom of political communication. So we have this freedom of political communication. Well, that will be changed by this bill, which will be declaring some things which come out as information or disinformation, just as they declared during COVID that were you to challenge aspects of COVID, for example, the need for lockdowns, that could be challenged, as that unfortunate lady, the mother in Victoria, who was arrested for putting a post on Facebook calling for a meeting about this. Remember, and she was arrested in front of her children and handcuffed by the Mr. Andrews police. Well, this will be the feature of Australia because we will lose our rights to. The only aspect of freedom of speech which is constitutionally guaranteed implicitly because of the existence of a representative democracy.
So we don't really need a Bill of Rights, and we don't really need anything other than that which we have depended upon and relied upon for years and years and years, which is the current system. Why would anyone want to fiddle with it? Why would any citizen want to allow government to fiddle with it?
Yes, and the other thing that the government has indicated is they're not going to have the Royal Commission that we expected in relation to the constitutional breakdown during COVID, where we had an extraordinary situation of regulations being made, not through a proper process through the Executive Council, not subject to disallowance by the upper houses, particularly of Parliament. We had all of this taking place where governors were acting like dictators, particularly that of Victoria.
I totally agree. Professor, I've got to go, but just quickly, have you ever seen a time as dangerous as the one in which we find ourselves at the moment?
I have not, and may I mention that if anybody wants to go to that conference and they're in Sydney, may I mention the reference? Just go
of course.
No Republic, that's one word, norepublic.eventbrite, that's event, B-R-I-T-E, .com.au, norepublic.eventbrite.com.au. It's going to be on Monday afternoon the 9th, but it will also later be available on demand on adh.tv.
Right, okay.
Which you can find on your televisions. It's not far from Netflix, actually, in the list of various things you can bring up on television.
Yep, but a hell of a lot more worthwhile, I would sense. I must go looking for it. Thank you very much, Professor. I've missed our chats, and I hope we talk soon. And let's hope this referendum, the one we could put them back in the box over this yes-no thing. They might not be so keen to get out with a republic.
And we must all fight to retain the freedom of Australia and the freedom we've known for so long and the freedom that Australians fought for and died for.
God bless you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor David Flint, ladies and gentlemen.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to AuscastNetwork.com for details.